Hello, I'm David Robbins and welcome to the Photographer Academy. Today I'm going to take you on a little tour of the camera and show you how to use the different shooting modes. Now you might be familiar with manual, but there's also aperture priority, shutter priority and program. Each of them has their disadvantages, but they also have their advantages too. And it might be simpler at some point just to switch to an easier mode and just get on and compose the picture and take some great shots. We're going to start by looking at program mode. Simplest mode in the world to use. You simply set it onto P or program mode on your camera and fire away. What it's doing is it's controlling the shutter speed and the aperture, the core parts of exposure. We all know that. What it means for you though is that you can ignore those and just get on and compose the picture. Okay. However, it only does it in a fairly basic way. It sets the shutter speed and aperture. As the light levels change, it increases them or decreases them on an even footing. So it's not really paying much attention to how you want the picture to be, to what the depth of field might be, or the shutter speed that you might want to use. Okay. So we're going to take some shots and use program mode and give you some samples of when it's an ideal setting to set up. We'll also have a look at shutter priority, allowing you to select a specific shutter speed for a particular kind of effect. Today we're outside the Ferris wheel and we're going to shoot some pictures with slow shutter speed. I want to get that nice creative blur effect, that wash of colour from using a slow shutter speed. But we'll also switch to higher shutter speeds and to freeze the action as well, so that we can freeze the moment. It may be you're shooting some sport and you want to freeze the exact peak of action, the ball just hovering in the air above the tennis player's head, that sort of thing. Finally, we're going to have a look at aperture priority. Aperture priority is literally the opposite of shutter priority. This time, you select the aperture, the camera takes care of the shutter speed. As light level changes, the shutter speed changes. But the aperture then is used to control the depth of field, how much of a zone of in focus the picture has. You can isolate a subject by throwing the background way out of focus and nice and soft and blurry, concentrating all the viewer's attention on what you want them to look at. Or if you've got something a bit broader and grander, you might want to use greater depth of field to bring everything from the foreground right through to the background into deep, sharp focus. The mode that gives you the most freedom is probably going to be manual mode, often described as M on the camera. Manual mode means that you have to set physically the shutter speed and the aperture yourself. Now you don't just randomly come up with a couple of numbers and set them on the camera. You need some kind of guidance from that. And there's two ways to do it. You can use the meter that's built into every camera. Okay. The advantage of that is it's metering through the lens, or TTL. And TTL metering is dependent on the lens that you use. So if you use a wide angle lens, it measures from a wider area. If you use a long telephoto lens, it only measures and concentrates from that area in which the lens can see. An alternative to that is to use a handheld meter, something like this. The beauty of this is you can take it to where your subject is and measure the light that's actually falling on the subject, not the light that's reflected back off the subject, because that can adversely affect your pictures. It doesn't matter whether the meter is a handheld meter or it's the meter that's built into the camera. They're all basically calibrated to exactly the same standard. And that standard you may have heard of as being 18% grey. A typical scene, if you were to mush up all the shades and tones together into one uniform tone, would be 18% grey. A handheld meter uses a white invicone, and the purpose of that is to dissolve or mush up all the colours so that they're effectively the amount of light is being measured evenly. Whereas the meter in a camera is measuring the light through the lens, and it's measuring focus light. So it can see detail, it can see areas of bright and areas of dark. So a disadvantage of having the internal meter is if you're pointing towards a subject that's predominantly dark, then it's not 18% grey and it will cause the camera's meter to give you an error reading. If you're photographing a subject that's predominantly white or light, again, it's not 18% grey, and so the metering will give you a false reading. But that's enough about metering for the time being. We're going to cover metering in depth in another video. Let's get back to what we're interested in today, which is the shooting modes. Okay, so let's just turn the camera on. And on this particular camera, the shooting mode is indicated by the LCD up there, and we change it by pressing the mode button. Other cameras will often have a dial with M, A, S, P, or AV, TV, and so on. It's exactly the same thing, it's just a different way of presenting it. So we can switch the camera into program mode, and using the back wheel on a Nikon camera, which is this thumb wheel just here, we can switch through P, S, A, and M. In P mode, the camera is free to change the aperture and shutter speed no matter what happens to the lighting, so you'll see those numbers just changing on their own. If I now just switch to shutter priority, I need to change the shutter speed and the camera will adapt the aperture speed to suit. And again, shutter speeds on this camera are changed on the back dial. Traditionally, they're changed on the front dial on a Canon. So just rotating the dial, one click is a third of a stop each time. So 3 clicks per stop. And we just change the shutter speed. And as you see, as I go up the shutter speeds, the camera's aperture changes. And if I just cover the lens, you can see the aperture changing, but the shutter speed stays the same. If I now want to switch to aperture priority, one more click through. And now the aperture, or the F number, will stay the same until I change it, and this time on the front dial. And I can switch between every aperture. Don't worry if your apertures don't look the same as this lens. Every lens will have their range of apertures they work from. Some lenses work from 3.5, some lenses work from 2.8, some even work from 1.8 or faster. Okay. So change the aperture, the shutter speed will adapt to suit the lighting conditions. So if I wanted lots of depth of field, I'd simply set somewhere down to say f16 or f22. And that gives me the maximum depth of field. If I wanted to create a shallow depth of field and throw the background nicely out of focus, I'd go down as far as the lens will take me, in this case 2.8, and maybe just pull back a little bit from that for best optical performance. And now if I want full absolute control, we're in manual mode. The back dial on this camera and most Nikon cameras will change the shutter speeds, while the front dial will change the apertures. And of course the metering there is to advise you, and that's what the little plus and minus dots are doing. They're advising me what it thinks is the best correct shutter speed and aperture combination. So I'm going to set program mode on the camera, and I'm going to have a little walk around and see what kind of shots I can come up with just by using program mode. See whether that works. That is probably the world's boringest picture. A couple of tourists just to put a bit of perspective in it. That works okay. So I've been having a bit of a wander around, taking some just general photographs, something that I would normally describe as snaps. Not really worried about the creativity too much. And for me, program mode is perfect for that. I can concentrate on the pictures, the views, the angles, the compositions that I'm interested in. I don't really have to worry about the aperture and the shutter speed. As the light level changes, and it has changed quite a few times in the last few minutes, as the sun has gone in and out behind cloud, as those light levels have changed, the camera has taken care of the aperture and the shutter speed, changing them to suit the level of light. Now, I don't think for a second that all those exposures are going to be absolutely spot on, but that's not really the point of that exercise. It's just about wandering around, having fun, taking some pictures. Now, I want to be a little bit more in control, and I found a fantastic scene, some wonderful waterfalls. And what I'm going to do is demonstrate the use of shutter priority, controlling the shutter speed while the camera takes care of the aperture. Okay? So even if the light levels change, whatever the shutter speed I choose will stay on the camera and the apertures will vary to suit. So what I'm going to do is take a slow shutter speed, allowing the shutter to stay open and allowing all that water to create fantastic blur and give a great sense of movement. And then I'm going to take the same picture from the same angle, but I'm going to use a high shutter speed, a fast shutter. And that's going to freeze the water and give a completely different impression to the picture. And this is where you can start to inject some creativity into your photography. So let's see what I can do. Let's switch to shutter priority and have a go. Okay, so I found a nice interesting angle. I've got the picture framed up, and like most photographers, I decided to leave the tripod in the car. So it's doing me no good here, so I just have to rely on the camera bag as a way of steadying it. Because my shutter speed now is going to be down to about 15th of a second. Way too slow to successfully handhold the picture, handhold the camera. Okay? Because I'm on a support of some sort, I've also switched to self-timer, because I don't want to be poking away at the camera or trying to handhold it. Okay? The self-timer on this camera has been set to a very short amount of time, so it's more convenient. So let's see if I can get some nice creative blur from these pictures, from these waterfalls. So what I'm going to do now is just change the shutter speed, increase the speed up to something that's going to freeze the action and give us some nice sharp water droplets as they spray out of the fountain head. And what we have here is a 640th of a second. That should be way fast enough to freeze all those water droplets. Let's see what we can shoot. Well, these were never really going to be earth-shattering, award-winning photographs, but they do really illustrate the beauty of using shutter priority. By being able to control your shutter speed, you can control the mood and the feel of the image. You can create a sense of movement, a sense of speed, even on something that's not moving. Or you can freeze the action to create a picture that would appear to be impossible. We've all seen shots of gymnasts apparently just floating in the air. Now, high shutter speeds will do that for you every time. With this technique, it's a little bit hit and miss because we can't be sure of exactly when the water splashes will happen. But we'll just take a few shots and hopefully we'll get ourselves a nice picture. Create some really nice abstract shapes. Let's just try that at a very slow shutter speed. See what we've got. You always have to take an opportunity for a picture where you can find it. So when a guide rides past on a bike, you grab it. Let's see what we have. I rather like that. A nice blurry shot of a cyclist giving a sense of speed. And that sense of speed is because of the slow shutter speed. If I'd used the fast shutter speed, it'd have been frozen and it wouldn't have given any impression of movement at all. Let's see what else we can find. been having a bit of fun playing around with program mode and shutter priority, but now I want to have a look at depth of field and focusing. And for that, we need to think about A or AV on a Canon camera, and this is aperture priority. So let me just switch the camera over to A. Now what happens, again, it's a semi-automatic mode. I've got control of the aperture, and I can use any aperture that's available on the lens, switching between those, and as I change the apertures, the camera will give me and select for me a correct shutter speed based on the metering we've built into the camera. So it's telling me what shutter speed I will use, and it will set that for me, leaving me free to think about the creativity, the depth of field, and so on. Now, a quick word about apertures. The smaller the number, f2.8, f3.5, the shallower the depth of field. The bigger the number, f16, f22, the greater the depth of field. There are other factors involved, the lens choice and your distance, but really what we're looking at is how the aperture affects that. So let's see what I can do with a few flower pictures. So, these are, I don't know the Latin name or the technical name, but they're quite pretty little yellow flowers, and I just want to get some details of a small group of those. And what I want is for the background to go out of focus, to be blurred. Now, to limit or to reduce the depth of field, I need to open up the aperture or let more light in, so I need to use a smaller number, f4, f3.5. And on this lens, I can go as low as f2.8. I'm going to pull back from 2.8 just a little bit to 3.5. And the reason for that is a lens's performance is best in its mid-range apertures. It doesn't perform at its best at 2.8. No matter what lens or what make, they all improve their performance as you start to stop them down a little bit. So we still need some nice crisp detail. So the camera's set to f3.5, and let's see what we can shoot. Now, using f3.5, the camera has given me a very fast shutter speed to compensate for that. But the depth of field, the amount of zone in which the camera is in focus, is very, very shallow. If I'm looking at this small bunch, it's maybe only about 3/4 to an inch in size. So not all of these flowers will be sharply focused. And that'll give me a nice sort of in focus, out focus kind of effect. If I wanted more of the flowers in focus, I need to change the aperture, stopping down to a greater number, 5.6, f8, f11, or even greater. I'm going to choose f16. The lens will stop down to f22, but those same rules applied about the lens not performing well fully stopped down or fully open. In this case, if I stop down too much, you'll start to introduce a little bit of degradation to the image just because of diffraction, a characteristic that all lenses possess. So now the camera's given me a much slower shutter speed, so I need to be careful and hold the camera steady. Let's see what we can do. So now in those photographs, I still won't have all of the flowers in focus, but more of them will be in focus. The depth of field is much greater. At this distance, depth of field is only going to be a few millimeters thick, resulting in some out of focus in front of and behind the subject matter. If we want greater depth of field, we need to move further away, use a smaller aperture, or switch to a wider lens. All those three things affected. When we work at normal distances, depth of field will be much greater, but it's still a factor that we have to consider. Depth of field is really useful for portrait work because you can control just how much of the subject is in focus, throwing the background nicely out of focus. So let's see what else we can come up with. So, for the last few minutes, I've been wandering around, trying out different shooting modes and enjoying myself, getting some creative juices flowing. We've looked at program, shutter priority, and aperture priority. But you mustn't forget manual mode. Manual mode allows you full creative freedom. You're not tied into the camera doing what it says it wants to do for you. And that really opens up some creativity. And I want to leave you with one last thought. If you regularly use one of these modes, if you regularly shoot on shutter priority, or you regularly shoot on manual, or you regularly shoot on aperture priority, don't be afraid to try something new. Switch to a mode that you're not familiar with. You'll learn an awful lot from the process. And also it will open up and allow you more creative freedom. If you're thinking about composition and lighting and focusing, switch to program mode just while you're practicing. That way you can not have to think about that. You can think about the other things important just to give your mind some creative freedom. Don't be afraid to experiment and have fun with your photography. I'm David Robbins, and this is the Photographer Academy, and I hope to see you again soon.